Good morning. Welcome to the fourth day in the Climate Mobility Pavilion. This is the Safe Pathways Day. So today we're looking at mobility opportunities and how they can be made safer with rights and dignity for the people who are forced to move or who decide to move. But we know that obviously the right to move comes with the counterpart of the right to stay. So unless you also have options to stay, the decision to move is not really one that is taken with agency and dignity. And we are very pleased this morning in this first session to look at research from Latin America and the Caribbean and to discuss some of the recent developments in that region, both on the legal side, on the policy side, to get a better sense of what are the realities of climate mobility in the region, how are people, communities experiencing the impacts of climate change, how is it affecting ongoing migration patterns in the region, and then also to, again, see how are governments and other actors, including communities, responding to those realities. What are the measures that are being taken to adapt? What are the measures that are being taken to protect people? And what are the cooperation prospects in the region? And we're very pleased to have as our first speaker somebody who's actually not in the room, but who very kindly agreed to send us a message to be part of this conversation, and that is the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, His Excellency Philip Davis, who sent us a video message to address the session, and we will listen to him now. So thank you, colleagues, for starting the video.
Good day to all. I am pleased to join you in this critical dialogue at COP30 as we work to elevate the existential threats posed by sea level rise to the top of the international agenda. I want to thank the Global Center for Climate Mobility for convening this important session, building on the momentum from the Climate Mobility Summit during the UN General Assembly in New York. For the Bahamas, sea level rise is not an abstract concern. It is our daily reality. Our islands, our people, and our livelihoods stand on the front lines of this crisis. Each hurricane season grows more intense. Our shorelines recede year after year. The very land that defines who we are is under threat. We saw this with Tropical Storm Imelda, which swept through the northern and central Bahamas. We saw it devastatingly with Category 5 Hurricane Melissa, which caused billions of dollars in damages and claimed dozens of lives across the Caribbean. The rising seas are not only eroding our shorelines, they're eroding our sense of security, our heritage, and our children's future. This is an existential threat to small island developing states and low-lying coastal nations. The science is clear, and the moral imperative is undeniable. The world must act with greater urgency and solidarity. We need a global response that recognizes the scale of what is at stake. The upcoming UN Sea Level Rise Summit in 2026 must deliver a truly ambitious declaration, one that upholds the principle of statehood continuity, preserves our maritime zones, and protects the rights and dignity of our people who may be displaced by climate impacts. The Bahamas believes this declaration must go beyond words. It must commit the international community to a coordinated, well-financed global response. We need partnerships that bring together governments, scientific institutions, international organizations, and financial institutions to strengthen community-led adaptation, build resilience, and provide legal protections for affected states like the Bahamas. The Bahamas and small island developing states as a whole contributes less than 1% of global emissions, yet we bear the weight of a crisis we did not cause. International cooperation must be grounded in fairness, in justice, and in tangible support for those of us on the front lines. According to UNDP, every dollar invested in climate adaptation and resilience can generate more than $10 in benefits over 10 years. This is not charity. This is smart investment in our collective future. I want to commend the success of the Community's Climate Adaptation Facility, or CCAF, which provides quick impact grants directly to communities within 90 days of application, up to $100,000 each. This facility supports community-led solutions that enable people to remain in place, respond to immediate threats, and build resilience. This is exactly what the Bahamas needs, and we look forward to participating in CCAF. Mechanisms like CCAF need dedicated funding. That is why I support a community levy of at least 3% from voluntary contributions to international climate financing institutions, earmarked specifically to enable community-led action. Together, we must build a global ecosystem for climate mobility, one that protects the right to stay while helping those who are displaced move safely and voluntarily without losing their rights or identity. I'm encouraged that there is clear convergence among the majority of states around the core elements of a comprehensive response. The Bahamas remains committed to working with champion leaders and partners across the Caribbean and around the world to address the existential threats posed by sea level rise. We will continue to be one of the most outspoken voices on climate change in the developing world, and I certainly intend to keep it that way.
I hope this was audible. um, this statement by Prime Minister Philip Davies of the Bahamas, and I think it underlined one of the key findings of our research that my colleague Emma will be presenting regarding the quite dramatic impacts of sea level rise on some parts of the region, which in the Bahamas is responsible for most of projected climate displacement. And so I think the statement here from the Prime Minister around the need to address this, not just through action nationally, but international cooperation, is a good starting point for our discussion today. I would like to call on our second keynote speaker, former President Carlos Alvarado of Costa Rica, Chairman of the GCCM Advisory Board. We're extremely pleased that you agreed to be with us here, and I would like to invite you to the podium to speak.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be in this panel, in this session. Throughout the last couple of years, I've been blessed to partner with GCCM on understanding more the phenomena, not only of climate change, but how it affects people and communities across the planet, and what we call the positive adaptive journeys that need to be put in place because of a phenomena. I usually say that the adaptation journeys are not specific to some communities. We, as a global community, we are adapting to climate change. We all are adapting to climate change in different ways. So what I want to share briefly for this session, connected to my own region, to Latin America, has to do perhaps of some of the comparisons of what I've seen between regions and what we can learn for Latin America. So maybe let me start with the Pacific and the Pacific Islands. When we discuss the conceptual frameworks of climate mobility in the Pacific, that comes very natural and very straightforward. It's a discussion you probably don't need to explain to anybody because it's existential. It's a discussion that when I was a kid, a gentleman will tell me, I used to play there football, and she will point to the sea. Because sea level rise is taking away their land, their homes. So this has accelerated a way of thinking into preserving livelihoods, into preserving culture and heritage, into making projects of adaptation to have fresh water, to be more resilient, the hospitals, the schools, to have shelters. And these kind of discussions are not alien, not to politicians certainly, and not to citizens. So I do believe that in the discussions of climate mobility, and that's why it's because they are the front foot of it, the Pacific is leading in this kind of reflection. Very natural comes to it. I will then turn to the Caribbean, which is part of the discussion, but in a different context in the Latin American region. In the Caribbean, too, in a more nuanced way, but the climate mobility circumstances are very present and pressing, and also climate migration. People from the Caribbean will say, even before that there was something called climate mobility, we were already migrating because of it. And we are here talking about the impact of hurricanes, connected with the impact of economic migration. For example, if a hurricane hits, it's not only the local circumstances, but it's the whole economy. And we have seen with several hurricanes in many parts of the Caribbean and in many countries. And that has triggered migrations within the region. For example, the Lesser Caribbean has already in place schemes in which people can migrate within those countries without much bureaucracy involved, or migrating to other parts, particularly to the United States. Recently, as you have seen, the latest hurricane that hit Jamaica put constantly into question what we ought to do in those circumstances. But climate change is making those hurricanes even more powerful in their capacity to destroy. So the discussion in the Caribbean goes to another level, bringing about not only the existential threats, because most of the critical infrastructure is on the shorelines for tourism, for transportation, for logistics, but also because it becomes a discussion of finance. How can you finance the resilience to confront these situations? So you'll see the Caribbean with robust schemes on climate mobility, very much connected to the finance needed for adaptation. But let's go to Latin America and let's say to the continent. And what do I perceive is the current situation? And the current situation is that the debate is not there. Because of the aggregate, climate mobility, it's not necessarily a big part of the current discussion in the region. And I can tell you by my own experience, in the continent, the climate mobility agenda and the adaptation agenda, and I'm going to stress on that word, adaptation, has to compete with many other agendas. Organized crime, to say one, migration in a different sense, and even the criminalization of migration, if you want. So I do believe that one of the obstacles to advancing in this agenda has a lot to do with the level of awareness and the level of proximity, and that the conceptual frameworks of politicians and on the public in general is perhaps not as mature in the discussion as the other regions have mentioned. And this has a consequential impact. Many of the dominant frameworks we use to address the phenomena come, for example, from the schemes of disasters and emergencies. But the traditional scheme of disaster or emergency is you have a first is impact response, and you have then a reconstruction response. And what is happening in the region? We end up building the same bridge several times. We end up paving the same road several times, that eventually in the next season, for example, might be flooded again. Because conceptually, we're not seeing the phenomenon. We think it's business as usual. And let's add other phenomena. In this case, it's not only sea level rise. Let's talk about migration, but let's talk about ecosystem migration. Given the change of temperatures, many of the ecosystems are migrating to different latitudes. So livelihoods that had been traditional for centuries are moving. Some populations perhaps do not perceive the necessity to move because some conditions, but its ecosystem is moving. And we're seeing that in crops like coffee, and we see it in many activities that support livelihoods. To comparison, it's similar to what happens with wine in the Mediterranean. Many of the traditional lands to cultivate wine are moving to the north. And that's changing livelihoods that have been there for centuries. Well, that's happening in our region, but we still do not have updated the conceptual frameworks to act upon that. That's why this conversation is so timely. To discuss about these topics, as we're going to hear from our panelists, and to keep growing this community, it's a way to change on how we think, but most importantly, how we act and how we learn upon, upon what we are experiencing. If I were to offer another advice, and that's why I strengthen the word adaptation, maybe perhaps there's the clue of bringing about the attention. Because if there's one thing people are seeing, not necessarily at the spheres of national governments, but more at the local level, or the community level, is that things are changing. We'll listen to farmers, we'll listen to the elders saying that this is very different from what we have been used for the last decades. That need for adaptation, it's a way to anchor knowledge and action. It's considered an adaptation in terms of heat and extreme weathers. It's considered an adaptation in terms of change in agriculture or change in weather patterns. It's considering how to adapt to the absence of water, to drought, but also to floodings. And that requires lots of data too. That's why this kind of knowledge reports, as the ones that Hara Hassad leaded for GCCM, is critical to guide knowledge and action, to educate people like me that used to be in positions of power of why not only think this about an emergency or an isolated event, but of a mindset to change how we act upon this circumstance that's happening across the globe, that we all need to adapt. That's why I celebrate that we have this panel, that we have specialists and young specialists that are studying and sharing their findings with us. Because, and I end with this, what really matters here is the community we built. A community of knowledge, of living knowledge. We know more now than we knew 1 year ago about this, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago. We're more knowledgeable. And that takes away the excuses regarding action. We know more about finance. We know more about the data and the science. We know more how to enforce frameworks and public policy. So there's no excuse to doing it. And therefore, there's no excuse for Latin America not to lead in this field as the Caribbean and as the Pacific are doing in the climate mobility schemes. So thank you very much for the panelists for being here and for beforehand for what you're going to share. And thank to the audience too, because you're also part of this vibrant and living community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Alvarado, for highlighting some of the challenges in terms of really reshifting or reconceptualizing how to approach some of these events that are familiar to some extent in the region, like the disasters, extreme weather are not necessarily new, but really the kind of long-term thinking and thinking through like how do we not just be in get trapped in a short-term cycle of responding, reconstructing, but really start thinking about what are the changes that need to happen in the response so that long-term people are in a better place, in a more resilient place. I would like to introduce our panel of speakers and then call them up to the stage one after another, because we have a few presentations and I think it'll be probably easier for you to see them from down there, and then we'll have you up on the stage. So we're very pleased to be joined by several colleagues from research and civil society efforts in the region, as well as my colleague Emma Winkley, who will share our own research from a regional level initiative we've been leading for the last 2 years with several partner organizations. So we go through presentations from Ms. Emma Winkley, Knowledge Associate here at the GCCM. We'll have next Ms. Maria Paulo Calvo, investigator at La Ruta del Clima. And then we'll have Ms. Giulia Mancini, researcher with RISAMA, as well as Mr. Sergio Chaparro Hernandez, international coordinator at De Justicia. So maybe I'll call Emma up first to do the first presentation.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really honored to be here presenting on behalf of GCCM alongside very distinguished colleagues from several of our partner organizations in the region. You said to point it to the... 1 minute, my apologies. Okay. Is it working? Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll get started. Yes, I'm here presenting the first phase of the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, which is a joint effort by the GCCM in partnership with the Association of Caribbean States, the ACS, which includes 25 member states that border the Caribbean Sea, including countries in subregions across, Mexico, Central America, Northern South America, and the Eastern Caribbean. So the geographic scope of this project looks primarily at those countries and has been supported by several other partners at the UN and the World Bank. So during the first phase of this project, which was launched a few years ago, we undertook research in the Greater Caribbean region that combined both field work in 6 countries, as well as modeling projections that looked at the economic impact of climate change on population distribution in the region. So I will briefly run through some of the key results of both streams of research, but I encourage you all to go to our website and look at the full report, which I have copies of the key messages here, and we can pass out after the session, because there's a lot of great information in there. So one of the first findings, and I'll briefly touch on sorry. Okay, so one of the first findings from our field research, which was carried out in 6 countries, including Costa Rica, Colombia, Antigua and Barbuda, Suriname, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, was that climate change is a lived reality across the region. Should be no surprise to anyone in this room. People are being affected by climate change in numerous ways and experiencing this through both economic and non-economic loss and damage. The top finding of the people that we surveyed in the 16 communities that our research teams visited were that actually mental and physical health were being the most impacted. And this was true at the regional level, but also when we disaggregated the results across the countries, the top reported impact was mental health or emotional well-being and stress levels for all Caribbean island countries. And in addition to that, physical health was the top reported impact in Colombia and the second most frequently reported at the regional level. In addition to these non-economic health impacts, we also saw a range of more, what we would more likely to consider more economic loss and damage in terms of income and livelihood disruptions, as well as food security issues as well. Yet, despite these ranging experiences, when we surveyed people about whether they were considering moving now or in the future, most people at the country level and at the regional level suggested that they have no plans or desires to move. And if you wanted to look at this per country, this is shown here in this yellow color. You'll see that people in Costa Rica were the most likely to report that they have no desire or plan to move, whereas people in Colombia were the least likely to report that they have no desire or plan to move. And this was largely because people had a very significant degree of place attachment to their homes and their communities. When we discussed, why they wanted to stay in place and were seeking out adaptation options in place rather than considering relocating or moving somewhere else, many people cited livelihoods, cultural attachment to land, and also generational ties to, and familial ties to both homes, property, and land. So really what we got out of this from both surveys and focus group discussions is that migration or relocation generally is seen as a last resort. So people are opting to pursue other adaptation and resilience building strategies prior to even considering moving somewhere else. And that is why, we have included a significant amount of adaptation and resilience building suggestions in our agenda for action, as Presidente Alvarado kind of touched on already. I'll go back one more slide. Pause on this slide for a second and just say that in addition to those that said that they wanted to stay and were not considering moving, there was also a significant amount of people that said that they were considering moving but were unable to. And this correlates to the turquoise or green color here on the bar chart. And this really showed us that there's populations in all of the countries that we surveyed that had low capacities to move, even if they wanted to. And when we did regression analysis of some of the variables that corresponded with the people that indicated considering but unable to move, we found that financial considerations, age, and gender were all associated with this lower capacity to move. And that varies a bit at the country level. And again, I encourage you to read the report to get more nuance on that finding. So this is one of the main findings from our report, and that's shown here in our in this bar chart. So again, this is a very brief snapshot of some of the current realities that are occurring in the region. And then we try to match or amplify the current realities with a projection of the way in which climate change might affect mobility from an economic perspective through an econometric model. So this model gives a look at the way that 5 different types of climate hazards might impact the economy across the region and the way in which the economic impacts might encourage people or not encourage them to move or to stay in place. So one of the first findings of this econometric model, which has projections through both 2030 and 2050, is that the region, economic opportunity will shift due to climate change across the region. We see that the model projects that by 2050, under the most pessimistic scenario, which corresponds to the Rocky Road scenario or the SSP3, RCP 7.0, for those of you familiar with these scenarios, we find that the average losses across the region could be up to 20% of GDP per capita. And this really varies. You can see where these impacts will be the most hard-hitting, with the bright reddish pink being the pixels or the 5 by 5 kilometer areas that will be the most damaged. And that really gives us the idea that that impacts will not be evenly distributed, and that some areas will require more intervention from an economic perspective than others. And in those areas that are the hardest hit, poverty is projected to increase, again, primarily in rural areas, as people's livelihood basis is impacted by different hazards. So as economic opportunities shift, people will both become more mobile and more immobile in response. And I'll explain why we see both an increase in mobility and immobility from the model. So up to, again, under the most pessimistic scenario, which is the Rocky Road scenario, we see that by 2050, up to 8.2 million more people, so those that are moving in response to climate change, could move permanently. And I will say very briefly to give context on this projection that our model only looks at permanent economically driven mobility. And it does not capture any short-term displacement or crisis-driven or other types of movement driven by other types of factors. So that is, the numbers that you see here only correspond to that type of movement. The model gives us a breakdown of who will move, but it also gives us a breakdown of the types of areas that might see population increase or population decline. We find that coastal economies that could be the most hard hit by impacts such as disasters, temperature rise, and sea level rise will see the most out migration, whereas urban areas, especially larger cities that are already quite urbanized with larger populations, will be significant destinations for people moving across the region. Most of this, in keeping with a lot of other models and the research on climate mobility, most people that move in response to climate impacts are projected to stay within their own countries. So we will see most of this mobility being internal migration. And those that do move outside of the region will move to traditionally or historically significant destinations. So in keeping with historical mobility trends, where the most significant portion will end up in the United States, followed by Canada and Spain. And those that do move or stay within the region, most will end up in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is projected to be the most significant destination within the Greater Caribbean region. And I think before I get to our agenda for action, I'll just say a quick word on immobility, and there's no slide on this, so I apologize, but I just wanted to note that our model also demonstrates immobility due to climate change, and that is largely because nowhere will be free from climate impacts, and we already know, as from Presidente Alvarado's keynote remarks, that, and as many of you know in the audience, that this region is already a highly mobile region. And so our model shows that people that would have otherwise moved in a world with no climate change are actually projected to be more immobile in a world with climate change, because the places that they would have moved to are also being impacted from an economic perspective, and their potential opportunities for jobs and employment and livelihood have dried up due to different factors. So I am taking, I think, probably too much of my speaking time here, so I'll wrap this up. But I just wanted to note that we took all of these findings, again, documented here in this report, and we used it basically alongside significant stakeholder consultations with about over, I think it was 1,200 to 1,400 people across the region who looked at our research and gave us feedback. We took all of that and put it into this agenda for action. We look at 7 actions presented here, and we've organized them into 3 different, core buckets of actions. One focused on adaptation, and this really is geared towards people that would like to stay in place. So those that have said, I don't want to leave my home and I need the option, I need the enabling conditions for me to stay at home. Then we've looked at, again, protecting rights through actions 3, 4, and 5. And that is, of course, geared towards people that both opt to stay or opt to leave. And then our last group of actions is really geared towards how we can scale up all of the actions from a multi-stakeholder perspective. So who do we need partnerships with? How do we mobilize financing? And our recommendations really look at bringing in a whole of society, a whole of government, and approaches, as well as creating partnerships across the Greater Caribbean region. Okay, so I will wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll pass it to my colleague at La Ruta del Clima.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay. It's very nice to be here with you all. Very nice to be here sharing this information, and thank you for the opportunity to come up in this panel. So, we're going to take a little bit of what's the context on human mobility, climate change regarding the advisory opinions of the courts, and how does that affect all of the negotiations and discussions that we are having, especially at this COP. So, for a little bit of context, we're going to talk about what is going on with this topic right now. So we know that from the latest IPCC reports, we know that climate and weather hazards are being every time moving more people and having more climate displacement across the regions. And we know that this is very important in the context of Global South, because as we've seen, states and displacement are having forced migration as one of the topics that are being affecting more people right now. And so this is very urgent to take action, and this is what we're going to talk about today. So how do we make this into action, and why is it important to see it not only as a thing that we should talk about, but also as an obligation to give a response and a reparation to this topic. So as we all know, the disaster displacements are threatening the people's enjoyment of their human rights, and this should be approached through what we call a comprehensive right-based approach. So when we're thinking about climate migration, this is not only about people moving from their homes, but also what is happening to all of their human rights, what is happening to their livelihoods, what is happening to their other affectations that are not only of moving from one place to another, but also from not being able to fulfill the enjoyment of human rights. Okay, so on the occurrence in human mobility, we know that displacement happens when we get to the limits of adaptation. So we are talking about when we are not able to, when the resilience and the adaptation limits are going over there. So what is happening right now? It's a symptom of loss and damage. So we know that in the current discussions of loss and damage, we are talking about how we are going to do this around the fund, what is going to happen with climate mobility, and we know that this needs to be addressed also through a lens of loss and damage, because people are not only losing their homes as an economic factor, but also many non-economic losses and damages, as Emma was mentioning in the past presentation, and also as we've seen when we're visiting the communities in Central America. We know that one of the main affectations that they are mentioning is actually mental health, because it's not only a process of my house being destroyed, but also what does this mean for me? What happens when you lose the photographs of your child being born, of the photographs of your graduation, or what happens when you can sleep? For example, in Costa Rica, when we're visiting at the community of Caldera, that is a coastal community, we know that some of the people were mentioning that they cannot sleep when they hear that it's raining, because they know that at any moment they are going to have to leave their house. And you know that this is not only a topic of it cost me this many dollars. It is only about what happens when you cannot live in peace, because you know that at any time you're going to lose your home and everything that you've worked your whole life for. So this is also a situation that perpetuates and magnifies what we call the adverse effects of climate change. And also this happens in the absence of preparedness, planning, the protection, and all of the assistance to displaced persons. We know that all of these effects of climate mobility are disproportionately experienced by some populations, so that are facing the marginalization and exclusion before disasters and displacement. And this condition of vulnerability is also regarding to gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnicity, minority status, and some other conditions that are making that these affectations tend to be worse in these specific populations. And this needs to be addressed, because we can not only have the same solutions for all people, but we need to address all of these historical conditions that are making some people more vulnerable to the also climate change in general, but specifically to human mobility and climate migration. When we're talking about justice, what is justice looking like in practice? So the first thing that we need to talk about is actually reparations and restitution. We know that it's a topic that tends to be left behind, or that there's some fear of using the word reparations, but we need to start using it, because the courts are saying that people are in the need of climate reparations, and the courts have said that this is not a topic of charity, but it's a topic of responsibility. So we cannot just see that it's a topic of please help me, but you actually need to help, and the states have a responsibility to make this happen. So there's need to be reparations and restitution. We're also talking about safe routes and protection for people on the move, and the support for people who cannot move. This integral lens also includes topics of mental health and psychosocial support, as we were mentioning before. The education continuity for students and teachers. This is also a topic that gets mentioned a lot because the moms and the parents are very preoccupied of what's going to happen with my children. They're not going to be able to study. What's going to happen when we move? Sometimes when they get moved for a period of time, they do not get education for that time, and that is also very worrying for children. And that's a topic that we also need to focus about, because who is going to speak for the rights of the children and the youth? So that is also very important to take into consideration when we're talking about reparations. And here we also have the reparations that include compensation, rehabilitation of livelihoods, the social networks, and all of the topics that make sure that we can enjoy our human rights, and the healing of territories that are no longer habitable. And that includes also the memory, the identity, the dignified relocation. Sometimes when we talk with communities about what's going to happen with the territory that you are habitating right now, it's kind of a difficult topic, because it's not only about just leaving the territory, but what's going to happen there. How do we remember all of the things that we lived there, all of the things that we built there? So there needs to be also a recognition of that, and include that is the healing of the territories. And right now we're going to go to the advisory opinion, and what does it say about a climate emergency and human rights. So as we know, this advisory opinion is clarifying the scope of state obligations, both individually and also collectively, to respond to the climate emergency that we're going through right now within the framework of international human rights. So here they're taking into account differentiated impacts and how this emergency has on different people, different regions, the population groups, also nature and human survival. So taking this into consideration, what does this advisory opinion say about human mobility? So there are some specific topics that it mentions. The first one is the prevention of forced displacement, and this mentions that the states must adopt adaptation measures such as land use planning, protection of livelihoods, water and food security, and adequate housing to prevent climate impacts from driving involuntary mobility. So we are stating that this is an obligation, and as we've mentioned in the before panels, this is also very linked to adaptation measures. Then the advisory opinion says that there needs to be the care and protection of displaced persons. So when we're talking about climate justice, there needs to be an addressing of when prevention is not enough. There needs to be regulatory frameworks, policies, institutions, and budgets needed to care for the people in transit. So this is also an obligation that needs to be taken into consideration, and the advisory opinion mentions it. Here we have also the cross-border dimension. So this includes good practices such as temporary admissions and humanitarian regularizations in disaster contexts that are recognized. And then, as I was mentioning, the children in climate mobility. So the court also mentions that there's an obligation to cooperate in designing national and regional policies that address all the children and youth that are being part of this displacement, and guarantee their rights. And also it makes a references to guiding principles for children on the move and the context of climate change. So what's next to happen? I think that there's very important to have a regional response to all of this situation, and also to make sure that we are using these advisory opinions to put pressure on to make sure that these solutions are actually going to be happening, and that they are an obligation. So we're talking about regional response to human mobility with key actors that are needed to be involved in this process. We are also going to mention the discussing and positioning on how to implement this advisory opinion, and ensuring that the states adhere to these responsibilities and assume their role in this process. Also, the need to generate reparations measures involving the populations who are most affected on the frontline action against climate change, and strengthen the reparations mechanism so that resources and technical guidance is given to the climate mobility related issues. This not only as an outside process, but also within the UNFCCC. We know that there are some negotiations right now. What's going to happen to the fund for responding to loss and damage? What are going to be these resources used for? What is going to happen with the WIM review? So all of these, when we're talking about loss and damage, needs to be directly linked to climate mobility as a loss and damage effect. So thank you so much for your time. I hope this presentation was useful for you all, and very nice to be here.
So good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Great. So I'm going to present. So I'm Julia Mancini. I'm from the South America Network on Environmental Migration. That is a network of independent researchers in Latin America. And with this network, we are trying to change the way we work with communities. The studies are made with them. So instead of having them as an object of study, for us, it's really important that the work is equal. We work together and not just having them as subjects and not as active agents. So I'm going to present today a project we had. It was our first independent project after 15 years of existence, showing how, for us, institutions can better work with them. Because we've seen a lot of regional policy developments. We are seeing in these presentations, we hear about them, the Chilean Declaration, the advisory opinion, and those are really important. And we understand there was some civil society consultations, but they are not really appropriated by the communities. And for them to have effect, the implementations need to be bottom up. And to be bottom up, the communities need to say what they feel, what they think, what rights are not being respected, and how can they implement those rights. And then I'm going to present the project that was called Desde las Bases, or from the grassroots, where we had this approach. We divided the project in 3 phases. The first one is to find solutions on the ground. So we did not map organizations, but really initiatives, projects, solutions that are already being implemented. Because while we are waiting for policies to be developed and those discussions at the regional and international level, the communities and the territories are already facing the destruction. And they are not there standing and waiting for the governments and institutions to act. They are developing the solutions and they are implementing them. So what we've wanted first is to find those solutions in the local level. What is being done? And many solutions, they are neighborhood associations, they are diasporas groups, they are people on the move, they are people that want to move but they are trapped and they can't leave their current situations, but they're still finding those type of solutions. But we didn't want also to just check their websites, check their social media and put in a big mapping. We want a detailed interview with them to understand what are the climate and environmental stresses and challenges they have, how they created these initiatives, who are working on these initiatives, what are the activities they are doing, what results they have, and what are the next steps, what else they need, what is the system they need to transform. And in this first mapping, we contacted 30 of these initiatives, and we mapped way more, but we understood that many communities, they are traumatized by extractive researchers that go there, take their knowledge, but then leave without giving them credits. Or even NGOs that go there, but they get the money and they do a little project, but then they leave and left them behind with no extra money, no support, no relationship, and no credit as well. So we had a long process of building trust with those communities through a snowball methodology, and communities we have worked in the 15 years of existence. And we managed to map those 30 communities. And we had a website that I forgot to put the picture here, but I'm gonna give flyers in the end so you can check there the information. It's not extremely detailed because, again, we want to prevent those type of extractive knowledge, but it gives an idea what they are doing on the ground. And there's all their contacts are there. So we invite you to contact them and have a honest conversation with them about that. The second step we wanted to promote was a community-to-community exchange, in the sense that they have the solutions, and we see that in the whole Latin America, we have very similar challenges, political challenges, social vulnerabilities, and legal challenges and environmental challenges as well. And when we were doing the interviews, we noticed that some of those community solutions could work for the others, and we are not here to teach them because they know a lot and we need to value their knowledge. So we did co-capacity building workshops where first we asked them, what do you want to know? They for recognize yourself as a community on the move, a trapped community, a relocated community, but what do you want to learn about the topic to increase your action, to become more powerful and enhance your initiatives? After filling this form, we designed these workshops, but having them as the main actors, in the sense that the academics, we built the common ground for conversation. We discussed concepts that were, many of them were really challenged by the communities, what was really interesting finding. And then we invited them to share those actions, these detailed actions, within different topics they choose, such as concepts of climate mobility, the type of vulnerabilities, adaptation and relocation, trapped populations, and advocacy and protection tools. And one important stand for us is that we plan to pay for their knowledge, because we all talk about valuing local knowledge and traditional knowledge, but no one really thinks about, if you're sharing your knowledge, if you're giving your time for this, of course you are learning as well, but you should be paid, you should be remunerated. So that's a stand that is very important for Resama, about really working with those communities. And the outcome was also really interesting. They shared each other's knowledge, and we promoted these online meetings, but we wanted to do more, and we organized an in-person meeting. And we chose specifically female women, because we understand that there are many women leading their communities, but they're not recognized. When you ask someone from an organization to point someone, most of the times it's a man. And the women, they are caring for their families, they are caring for their neighborhoods, for the women, for the elderly. They're caring for the whole community, but many of the times they don't have the opportunity to care for themselves, and they need to be strengthened and empowered in this sense as well. So we chose these women from the communities, and there was a really extensive work to bring people from the territory for this in-person meeting in Sao Paulo. That happened last week. So the findings are still, we're still writing to publish it with all the methodology, but now I'm going to present a little bit what we did there. So again, for us, the first step we did with these communities is for them to identify what they have in common. And with that, we did a cartography where they identified where they were born, and they said where your umbilical cord is buried. Where do you live now? What are the environmental challenges you have where you were born? What are the climate, environmental, and social challenges you have where you live? What are your journeys, your migration journeys across the continent? Then, we had this really nice map with all the messages they wanted to give. But our second step was also about sharing about your body, because people, the territory for them, it's also their bodies. So they showed us where they feel the climate environmental impacts in their own bodies, but also where they take the strength from to keep fighting and keep finding the solutions that they're doing by themselves. And again, we had this, it was huge, so we couldn't really stand and have the whole thing for the picture, but this gives an idea. And we ended the day also with a very important exchange of how to take care of yourselves for those women, so they could empower each other and have understand that we are all Latin America, we are all the same territory. In the second day, we adopted a different approach that was to draft a regional advocacy mechanism from these women, and we called it was a regional rights letter, specifically for this context, because besides recognizing each other and exchanging solutions, they need to have tools to bring to their governments, to the local, regional, national governments. So we did this methodology where they had to find 3 axes that they felt their rights are not being fulfilled, and what are the demands, so what they need, what rights they need to be respected, so they can reach this improve their solutions, right? And was really interesting because they chose climate finance and economic solidarity. They chose climate justice. They chose education, but they always stand for one extra X that was gender, because they said we all understand that gender is cross-cutting for everything, but no one looks from the gender point of view and how this impacts climate mobility. So we had 4 axes, and on there they identified first what is their shared dreams, what is the ideal world for them regarding that within climate mobility. Then they identified what they are already doing to get there, and that was amazing because they are doing so much, and they really connected at this point and shared those detailed practices without the fear of extractive knowledge of being copied, because they know they can cooperate with each other. After this, they shared what is the challenge they have to get there, what is the system imposing on them that they want to transform, and from that they reflected on what are their demands, what rights they want to have respected within this axis and within the climate mobility context. Again, we are still drafting the outcomes from this letter, and we're very happy to share afterwards in our website and our social media, so I invite you all to follow. Soon we have this. And I think the key message we had in this project is that although we have important developments at the regional and even some countries in Latin America, the communities really need to be included in these discussions, and not only consulted for formal mechanisms, but consulted in their own territories, because they know, they feel, and they act. So communities are leading the responses on climate mobility, but they need adequate resources, direct financing for them, not through NGOs that are intermediating the implementation and leave them behind afterwards, but they know how to use this money because they do so much with very little resources. They need policies that are bottom-up policies, not designed from the top, but they participate on the design. And with this letter, we show that they know what they need. They know what policies are necessary. They know how they should be implemented. Protection, and empowering them is the way forward for climate adaptation in the context of mobility, e-mobility, and it's really important to them to say, we don't want to stay here. Many of them told us, but we can't move. Many communities in urban context told us, we feel trapped because we know we have to, and they are preparing their children and youth to move and to learn to adapt in other territories, waiting for the proper conditions when they can do that. And what they demand mostly is access to rights related to climate finance and solidarity economy, education, climate justice, and gender-focused answers. And I guess that's it. Thank you.
Good morning. It's okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sergio Chaparro. I'm the international coordinator at the Justicia, Colombian human rights NGO, and let me start by thanking the Global Center for Climate Mobility for hosting us here, as well as our co-sponsor organizations in this panel. I will be really quick because I will need to wrap up soon to go to the next panel. And basically, I wanted to present very briefly the findings of 2 reports that we were able to take part at the Justicia. So the first report actually is a report that was co-produced by more than 20 organizations called Climate Justice and Human Rights, Legal Standards and Tools from the Inter-American Court's Advisory Opinion 32. And this report has a special chapter that develops and explains in detail the standards that the advisory opinion provides to states to guide their policies on climate-related mobility. I must say that that chapter was co-authored by Laura, who is present here. I don't want to reiterate what La Ruta mentioned before. That is a very good summary of those standards. But the second report that I wanted to present some findings is a report that we produced at the Justicia called Movilidad Humana y Emergencia Climática, Climate Mobility and Climate Emergency, and Human Mobility and Climate Emergency. That is a report whose main thesis is that the current international legal architecture, as well as the domestic law systems, have a deficit of protection to protect climate-related mobility. And therefore, like to respond like comprehensively to climate-related mobility, we need not only to adapt our policies, but also to adapt law, the architecture of law. And to that end, the report proposes several paths, both to from strengthening the legal regime internationally, for instance, in regards to refugee protections, to domestic measures for adapting law internally. In Colombia, for instance, there has been progress by the Constitutional Court in recognizing that uh, mm, climate displaced people are require a reinforced protection on constitutional grounds, and has ordered in a couple of cases to the state to comprehensively address like either adaptation measures to respond to disasters that have hit hard, for instance, the islands in the north of the country, Providencia and San Andres, or to prevent the damage that can be caused based on the information that we have available, potential events of climate mobility, because as we saw, like in Emma's presentation, people are really attached to their lands. So the first measure should be to try to come up with the adaptation, with strong adaptation policies to prevent climate mobility in the first place. But in any case, as the advisory opinions state, it's very important that when mobility cannot be prevented, it's that mobility is managed according to human rights standards. So I would like to highlight that in addition to the normative the normative challenge, there is a huge implementation challenge, because where the resources will come from to fund and implement these policies. If all these impacts have been generated mostly because of the responsibility of the main polluters, but countries in Latin America, without being the main responsibles of the problem, will need to provide the resources needed for funding strong adaptation policies or even reparations for loss and damage, where that money will come from, and how can we design funding strategies that actually respect the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. So even when, like it seems a topic that is not directly connected in the negotiation space with the impact of climate mobility, climate finance becomes an essential topic for addressing this, and for doing it in a way that Latin American countries do not end up adopting policies and paying for policies for the damage caused by other actors. So it's very important that we integrate considerations on climate finance in the climate mobility policies, and that those fields speak to each other, so that states are in a capacity to address the huge challenge that they will have in terms of implementation of the advisory opinions. So the main message is, here we face a power struggle, because we are not seeing that these spaces are delivering in terms of providing the resources that are required to address this challenge in a fair manner. So it's very important that communities that can be affected by this challenge are able to speak and participate in spaces where the key decisions on finance or the key decisions on the implementation of public policies are taken. So I would like to conclude by emphasizing the need of a cross-movement collaboration, so that this challenge is comprehensively addressed. Even if we have now very strong responses from the regional domestic system, the Inter-American system in clarifying the standards. If this does not translate into into decisions about resources and the implementation of concrete and comprehensive public policies, we will see all the impacts that the models are predicting, and therefore we really need to act together for changing course. Thank you so much.
Thank you, colleagues. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I think it was a great overview of different approaches. First of all, a great overview of the work that's happening in the region, and it's great to see that that there is this active network already, both on the research side, advocacy side, and I think that in itself is really encouraging. Thank you for highlighting both the wonderful work you're doing with communities. I love the methodologies you were showing. And also really the kind of legal advocacy, for strong follow-up to the Inter-American Court decision, which I think was really, like a very strong statement in terms of existing legal obligations of states. And of course, we know that implementation is always a challenge, but I think it really gave a very strong boost by saying basically these obligations already exist. And then I think lastly, I would love to see how we can, continue engaging, because we would like to see, building on our work in the region, how we can continue keeping momentum with governments, but not just governments, building this kind of multi-stakeholder coalition that can really advance the issue across the region and build a common understanding and agenda. So thank you, everybody, and thanks to the audience. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions, but I hope you can get to catch up with the panelists after the event. And thank you.